Welcome back, everyone. For today's video, we are going to be taking a look at the 5th round of the 45th Chess Olympiad, which is taking place in Budapest, Hungary. Now, the 5-time world champion, Magnus Carlsen, is competing. Thus far, he is on a score of 2 out of 2, having won 2 very clean games. Now, today begins the quest where he starts playing GMs who are a little bit stronger. He's playing as Mustafa Yilmaz from Turkey on board number 1. Now, you may or may not know Mustafa Yilmaz, but he is a player who's very dangerous. He actually came very close to defeating Fabiano Caruana in the FIDE World Cup last year in Azerbaijan, so he's someone that you should not take lightly. All right, let's jump right into the action. So the game starts with the move d4 from Mustafa, and Magnus plays knight f6. We get c4, e6, and here we have the move knight to f3. Magnus plays d5, we get knight c3, and now we have the move knight bd7, and Mustafa decides to trade the pawns on d5. Now, white can also play bishop f4 or bishop g5. There are a plethora of choices, but Mustafa wants to go for something where the structure immediately becomes very fixed. There are no options for black to take or white to take, less decisions. So we get takes, now we have bishop g5, and we get the move c6. And this is what is known as the classic Carlsbad structure, where you have these pawns versus these pawns. You can get this in many openings from the white side or the black side. One of the more common ways you reach this structure is actually out of the Caro-Kann, where you get it from the white side after takes, bishop f4, knight c6, and now you get the move c3. And at some point, black plays e6. And once again, you have the 4 connected pawns, and black has these 3 in the center. So we get the fixed Carlsbad structure here after c6, and now Mustafa goes e3. We get queen to a5, and now we have the move bishop d3. Here Magnus goes for knight e4, and we get this move queen c2. Now what Magnus is trying to do is create complications early in the game. Normally you would not bring your queen out to a5. In fact, more often than not, you'd play something like bishop e7, bishop d3, castles, and we reach a very standard position in the queen's gambit decline. All right, so Magnus trying to trick his opponent very early, but Mustafa is well prepared for this, and we get the move knight takes bishop. Here Mustafa plays knight takes knight, and now we get the move h6, knight to f3, and we get this move bishop d6. Now, one thing that I did notice is the times are missing in this analysis board, so I will try to give you a little bit of an idea, but at this point, the players are moving relatively quickly. We get the move castles, knight f6 is played, and now Mustafa goes rook a e1. Here, Magnus castles out of the center of the board, and now we get the move knight to e5. Now, this is a great decision by Mustafa because what he's trying to do here is play f4 to overprotect this horse in the center that's attacking all these pawns potentially. And if you can get the knight on e5 with the pawns on e3, d4, and f4, it could be very serious. Magnus goes a6 here, and now we get the move f4. You're probably wondering, why did Magnus play a6? And the reason is that if he were to play c5 right away, he was probably concerned about something like knight b5, maybe not this exact position, but worried about knight b5 here hitting the bishop and the weakness of the pawn on c5. So we get a6, f4, and now we have c5. No knight b5 is in play. But white does, of course, have the classic diamond hands formation with the pawns on e3, f4, and d4, as well as the knight on e5. Now, one thing that concerned me about this position from Magnus' standpoint is that it's turning into a situation where it's going to become very sharp and not positional, because when white has his knight on e5, he's looking to attack towards his king side if possible, maybe pushing some pawns on the king side as well. And with white not having any other real concrete plans, I started to get worried because in general, and I mentioned this many times, when you're playing against stronger players, one advantage you can have if you're lower rated is getting into big tactical complications because you can't out-calculate your opponent on occasion. So Mustafa goes queen f2 here, trying to bring the queen towards the king side, and now Magnus plays b5, and here we get the move bishop b1. Magnus goes bishop b7 here, trying to guard the pawn on d5 and preparing to potentially bring a rook to e8 here, or to play something like knight to e4. And here this bishop on b1 is simply on a locked diagonal. You have the bishop guarding the pawn, and now there are no threats to create a double A battery. Whereas, for example, if you could get this and say rook e8, say rook c8, knight d7, all of a sudden black is actually in a lot of trouble here as white is trying to checkmate on the king side. However, after bishop b7, one of the big issues is that now white can play the move g4, which happens in the game. And this is a move that I was screaming for to be played by Yilmaz, because when you go g4, you're trying to attack. And as I said, positionally, the top players are simply too good. They're not going to make blunders in positional situations, but if you can attack them and play for tactics, they will sometimes get scared. They will sometimes make mistakes. And if you understand that you're worse in positional play versus the top players versus tactical play, you should go for this. So Yilmaz making the most of his chance. He plays the move g4, and now we get the move queen c7, and here we have the move h4 being played. Now, I love this from Yilmaz. He's just being a classic Turk, just attacking Magnus here, going for glory. Who knows how many times he'll have the chance to play against Magnus Carlsen, the world champion, but he is going all in here, trying to attack and checkmate Magnus's king. So Magnus goes knight e4 here. We get takes, and now we have the move g5 being played. Now, this is a move that aims to potentially open up the g file. Say you get like rook c8, and you can open up this file. Maybe you can attack towards the black king on g8. Also, if black were to play like takes and hg5, now you have ideas to eventually go queen h4, followed by rook f2 and rook to h2 to try and checkmate on the h file. So Magnus here plays this move f6. This is a move that I actually like from Magnus. It's not the best move in the position, but everything is getting very shaky here. If you were to trade on d4, now white is threatening to win this pawn on e4. You still have the issues on the king side with the weakened king, and it's very difficult to play. So Magnus goes to f6 here. We get pawn takes pawn, and this is where Magnus makes a fairly serious mistake when he blunders with the move pawn takes pawn. Now, in this position, what Magnus should have played was simply rook takes pawn. Perhaps he's worried about queen g2 here, followed by bishop takes pawn on e4. But after rook a, f8, bishop takes e4, you trade the bishops off, and after cd4, ed4, and queen c8, white is up a pawn here, but you will notice the king is weak. There's a square on g4. The pawns on f4, d4, and h4 are all quite loose in the situation. After rook f2, white is still probably a little bit better here, but with a very weakened king here, after say queen h3 or even queen e6, it's really, really hard to believe that Magnus would be in trouble. In fact, I think there's a very good chance that he could even win this position. So instead, Magnus takes with the pawn, and this is simply a tactical mistake, as white now has the move queen g2 check. You have to block. If you move the king to h8, there's knight g6, forking the king and the rook and winning the game. And if you go king h7, now there's queen g6 check, king h8 takes, and if you go king g8, now white can play rook to e2, followed by rook g2 here, and suddenly the black king is getting absolutely murdered on this g file here. It's just absolutely hopeless. So Magnus goes queen g7, but now white is able to play this move d takes c5. And I suspect that when Magnus took with the pawn, he simply blundered this tactical idea here because he ends up having to play the move bishop takes e5. Now, as I mentioned, for whatever reason on this PGN of the game, there are no timestamps, but at this point, Yilmaz Mustafa had about, I think, 8 minutes or 7 minutes. Magnus, I think, at this point had about 19 or 18, somewhere around that range. But it's very clear that Magnus just blundered here. He probably thought after bishop takes c5, he's completely fine. But here white has a very strong move, knight to d7, forking the bishop and the rook. You cannot take the horse because then that would put your king in check. And if you go rook c8, now after knight takes f6 check, you can't take, obviously. We get king h8, takes, and knight takes e4. And after bishop b4 and rook e2, white simply has 2 extra pawns in the center of the board here and is technically winning. So Magnus ends up playing the move bishop takes knight, Yilmaz takes, we get takes, and now we have rook f8, and rook d1. At this point, the weak chess.com engine only gives it as +1 for white, but according to the supercomputer Sessa, which was analyzing this game live, white's advantage here is +5 with perfect play, meaning that with perfect play, white will win the game. Now, I give Magnus a lot of credit. This speaks to how great of a player he is because it'd be very easy, knowing that he's blundered here, to start to lose some control and simply get into a lot of trouble. But he plays this move b4. Now, by a lot of trouble, I'm not saying that this is okay or anything, but b4 is the one move that creates a little bit of a wrinkle or an imbalance in the position. Now, the reason I mention that is because one of the lines the computers were suggesting as a top line is rook f3. But after a line like, I think it was rook d7, let's just say rook g3, takes, and b4 here, white is going to end up in an endgame where after takes, bishop d5, and white goes bishop c2. White can never lose here. Now, is white actually winning this position? I'm not sure, but you'll notice that in general, with these 2 pawns protected, or even the pawn on a3, black can never go after the pawns on this chain, and white can go after all of black's pawns. You even have a4 potentially, but if you get these pawns on these 2 squares guarding each other, black will never have a chance to survive the endgame, and black most likely will lose. But when Magnus goes b4 here, he creates a wrinkle in the position because now white is never going to get this endgame. So say you were to trade the queens, go rook d7, rook f7, takes here. You don't get to push the pawn to b4, and so black is simply bringing the king to the center of the board, and he will win the pawn on c5. Now, in this position, Mustafa was down to about 3 minutes on the clock. It's a tough spot to be in without a lot of time to think, but this is where he actually misses the winning move, which is bishop to c2. Now, the reason that this move is winning is probably a little bit counterintuitive, but I'll explain why. The reason this move wins is that the main idea or concept for white is to trade the queens and go rook d7 check, but after rook f7, the rooks come off the board and black is okay. So when you go bishop c2, first of all, you'll notice the pawn on e4 can't be captured, but the bishop on b1 is simply doing nothing on this diagonal. So when you go to c2, you have 2 points. Number 1, you can play something like bishop to a4. Let's just say takes, and bishop a4, followed by the pawn thrust, pushing the p forward with c6. You can also potentially play something like, let's just say black goes rook f3 here in this position, where you go bishop b3, checking the king, and after king f8, you trade the queens, and you go rook d7 check, and suddenly the rook cannot block here, and you win the bishop on b7 and the game as well. So bishop to c2 would have been an extremely strong move. I think the best line the computer gives is takes and rook f6 here, but now after I think rook d8, king g7, rook d7, rook f7, and rook d6, white is in the long-term winning here. I think because now when you go rook c7, trying to win this pawn on c5, white has bishop to a4, threatening to push the pawn to c6. Of course, if you take, there's rook d7 winning the bishop. And after, I don't know, bishop c8 and something like c6 here, with this protected pawn on c6, the ability to bring your bishop back, white is completely winning. Instead, Yilmaz plays the move rook d6, which frankly I think is more human considering the limited time on the clock. We get the trade of queens, and now we have the move rook c8. Now at this point, Sessa still says that white is winning, but you have to be 100% precise here. And with limited time on the clock, Mustafa does not play the best move. Now after this move h5 here, white is still much better, or in fact winning, because the main point behind this move is black still can't take, so check, and then rook d7, winning the bishop. And with the pawn on h5 one square closer, after say king to f8, I think you go rook d7, bishop c6, rook h7, and now this pawn is one square closer to the end of the board. I think king g8 takes, bishop d5, and c6. Something like this is probably winning. Again, I don't know exactly why, and it's not completely obvious, but I do know that h5 would have been the winning move. Instead, Mustafa now plays move rook b6, and this is a move that I completely understand here in this position because he's low on time. You don't want to make a mistake. You are playing Magnus Carlsen, who seemingly can create magic from any position on the board. And after this move rook b6, now the game is headed towards a draw. We get bishop d5, rook b4, rook takes c5, and now we have the move bishop takes e4. Magnus plays the move bishop takes a2, and with both sides having even number of pawns on the board here, the game should end in a draw. Mustafa goes rook a4, attacking the bishop and the pawn, and now Magnus plays this move bishop to f7. It's worth pointing out bishop c4 would be a huge blunder trying to guard the pawn on a6 because white could sack the rook. With rook takes bishop, takes, and after bishop d5 check, king's got to go, you win the rook and the game. So Magnus goes bishop f7, we get rook a6, rook b5, rook h6, rook b2, and now the move king f3. At this point, Mustafa is up a pawn on the king side, but the position is objectively a draw. Magnus plays rook b4, we get bishop f5, king g7, check, king f6, and now we have the move e4 trying to support the bishop on f5. Magnus plays rook b1, we get rook h6, king g7, rook h7, and after rook h6 here, we get the move rook to d6. Now, I went through that a little bit fast, but basically we're getting these double repetitions here where Mustafa is trying to gain a little bit of time on the clock and keep the game going. Magnus plays bishop h5, we get king g3, and now we have rook b3, king f2, and we get the move rook f3. King g2, rook f4, and now we have king g3, check, king h2, rook f2, and the move king g1. Now, white could obviously play king g3 here, rook f3, king g2, and make the draw, but I think that Mustafa at this point, he was enjoying the moment, enjoying the spotlight. He's playing as Magnus. Everybody knows the game will be a draw at this point, but he probably wanted to just sit there, keep it going, and bask in the sunlight. So we get rook f4. We get rook d7 here. Worth pointing out, rook e6 would be the one last attempt to try to keep the game going. But after rook h4, rook takes e5, and something like bishop g4, for example, the game will end in a draw here after takes, king f2, king f7, and then rook g1 here with only a rook and a pawn versus a rook. This is a theoretical draw. So the game does end here by repetition. We end up with this repetition, and it is threefold, and Magnus Carlsen draws this game against Mustafa Yilmaz. So what to take away from this game? Now, what we take away first and foremost is, as I've mentioned before, when you're playing a super elite grandmaster or someone who's 200-300 points higher rated than you, the one way that you always have chance potentially to beat them is if you get into tactical positions where mistakes are possible, where it's pure calculation. There's nothing about like trying to maneuver pieces, just put a piece on this square, calculate this move, this move, this move. And if you can do that, you will always have chances. So Magnus overlooked this knight d7 tactic. Fortunately for him, he was able to still make the draw, but he does lose quite a few rating points with this draw. That being said, in spite of Magnus's draw, it does appear that Norway is going to win their match against Turkey because Aryan Tari is most likely going to be one of the super talented juniors of the world, the 13-year-old Yilmaz Khan Erdogmas, who is currently rated 2600, but it appears that Aryan will win that game, so Norway will most likely win the match. All right, so let's move on to the next game. So next game we have to take a look at is a game played between Arjun Erigaisi from India and Rauf Mamedov from Azerbaijan. Now, Arjun is a player who needs no introduction. He's been rising through the rankings, just dominating 2500s, 2600s, winning every game in the opens. His rating has gone from roughly 2730 or 2720 to almost 2790 in the last year or so, just by beating 2500s and 2600 GMs every single game. So Arju going to this game, he's on 4 out of 4, riding the wave, and he's playing against Ralph, strongest player he's had to face so far in the tournament. So we get e4, c5 is played here, and now we get to move knight to f3, d6, and we get to move d4. We get takes, knight f6, knight c3, and now we have to move g6, bishop e3, bishop g7, f3, knight c6, queen d2, castles, and bishop c4. Here, Ralph decides to trade the knights on d4 and play this move bishop e6. Now, it's worth pointing out that one of the people who really revolutionized or revitalized the system was none other than yours truly, myself, Grandmaster Hikaru Nakamura, because I played this in 2012 in the Tata Steel tournament against Anish Giri, a game which would end in a quick draw. I also had this in 2023 in the Qatar Masters event against Yavokir Sindarov from Uzbekistan. So this is a system that I've really pioneered and brought back to life, and Ralph is trying to play like Hikaru. So we got bishop b3, queen a5 castles. Now we have to move b5. And here we got to move king b1 from Arjun. Now in this position, Ralph plays move b4. Worth pointing out that my game against Anish from 2012, I believe it went rook c8, takes, knight d5, takes, check, king g7, knight h5, takes, and after rook d2, rook c5, I believe the game ended in a very premature draw between Anish and myself. So instead, we got the move b4 being played here. Also, just to point this out, this is going to end up in a situation, this position, I did have this against Yavokir Sindarov last year in the Qatar Masters. This is also a position that I'm pretty familiar with. And here we got the move queen d3. Now here, Ralph trades the queens, and he makes a mistake with this move, rook fc8. Now the correct move to play here is knight d7, and this move is a little bit counterintuitive because you probably think after takes and rook to e3, this pawn on e7 is weak. After king f6 and rook he1, if you ever go rook e8, there's always bishop a4, pinning the knight, massive pressure on the pawn on e7, and black is in all kinds of trouble. This is why I will tell you guys, it's very important to memorize your lines, have some idea of what you're doing, because if you aren't super precise, and Ralph is not precise here, you can very quickly end up in trouble. Ralph instead plays a very logical human move, rook fc8, but now after the move rook e1, rook c7, and c3 here, white is able to start to challenge the black queen side. You'll notice that white has 3 pawns here on a2, b2, and c3. Black has pawns on a7 and b4. So in the long run, if white can get an endgame with these 2 pawns going up the board versus the 1, white should have great chances to win the game. Ralph goes a5, we get the trade, and now we have the move g4 being played. Here, rook a c8, we got rook d1, and now we have bishop to h6. A very logical move here. What black is trying to do is stop white from trading off pieces on the c file, because if white were able to trade off, just ignore this for a second, and I'll just set this up somehow just to illustrate the point. If we were to reach a position like this, for example, white has great winning chances, first of all, because you can go after the pawn on b4 with bishop b6 and bishop a5. But even aside from that, you can even play a4, and with this outside pass pawn running up the board here, white has great chances to win. So we get h4. Ralph plays bishop f4. We get bishop b6, rook b7, and now we have the move bishop to e3. What white is trying to do here is trade off the bishops in the long term, try to win this pawn on b4 or the pawn on e7. We get bishop takes bishop, rook takes, and now we get the move king f8. Bishop a4 is played, and now we have the move rook c5. I will point out that here black probably should have played rook c5 first to stop bishop a4, because now you would hang the pawn on d5. Instead, we get king f8, bishop a4, rook c5, and now we have bishop c6. White is guarding the pawn and covering a couple of other critical squares from whence the knight would like to jump. And additionally, after rook a7, g5, knight d7, and rook d4, now white is trying very hard to win this pawn on b4, get these 2 connected juicers running up the board, and win the game. Now, at this point, it's already very difficult for black to play, but Ralph makes a serious error when he plays this move knight to b6. In this position, knight e5 is pretty much the last opportunity to try and save the game. After takes, white can go check, king g7, and a3 here. And you will notice that both sides have the same number of pawns, 5 pawns each, but white has the 2 connected pawns, and even if black gets a position like this, for example, just to illustrate the point, you're still not able to create the 2 passed pawns. If you go e4, I obviously take. If you go f5, I play end peasant, and again, you're never really getting the 2 connected pawns in the middle of the board rolling forward, so with only 1 passed pawn here, which is a d pawn, and unable to create the 2nd passed pawn to control the pawn thrust, white is probably winning. But that being said, this would have been the last opportunity for Ralph to try and save it, because after knight b6, now we get rook to b3, another excellent move here. And with the rook being able to be activated on the b file here, as we're about to see, the game is simply pretty much over. We get e5, takes, rook b8, king g7, takes, and now we get to move rook 3, b7. And this is simply a masterclass from Arjun Erigaisi, because what he's doing here is the rook is now in the 7th rank, creating the kebab. And if you don't trade the rook, say you go rook a6, I can simply go rook d8, followed by rook to d7 here to win the pawn, or rook b8 as well, creating a checkmate threat. Actually, rook d3, rook b8 is simpler. So if you take, it's checkmate in 1. And if you push the pawn to f6, now there's rook b7 checkmate, as the king has no squares available. So after rook 3, b7, now Ralph has to trade the rooks, which he doesn't want to do, because with only one set of rooks on the board, now white is pushing p very fast here. The a and b pawns are going up the board, and it's simply close to loss. So Ralph plays move rook d4, and this is maybe a mistake here. I think h5 here first would have been a little bit better. Very counterintuitive decision to do this, because after takes, you think, well, rook takes f7, what's the big deal? You just lose. But black can actually go g5 here, and after takes, king g5, let's just say you go b4, for example. Black can play rook b5, a3, and after rook to b8, followed by d5, d4, and rook a8, black's king and the pawns are so close together that apparently this is a draw. Don't ask me why it's a draw, because it looks losing for black, but it is a draw. Instead, Ralph plays rook d4. We now get the move b4, and here we have the move rook takes h4 being played. This is a move that effectively loses, but I understand this at this point, what are you supposed to do? White is just pushing the pawns. You have nothing else to do here. Maybe you can still go d5, and after a4, I guess there's e4 here to try and survive. At any rate, it looks completely hopeless. Even king c2, e4, takes, and king c3 looks very good for white. So Ralph decides to play rook takes h4. We now get the move a4. h5 is played. We get n peasant, rook takes, and now a5, followed by a6. At this point, there's nothing Ralph can really do. He goes rook h3. We get a6, takes, rook b5 played here. And this is the last nice touch. a7 is also good enough, by the way. After rook a3, b5, e4, b6, e3, you can simply go rook e7 or king c2, bringing the king back. But rook b5 is a nice little touch here, because if black ever tries to go rook a3 now, you always can build the bridge with rook to a5. After takes, you push the pawn up the board. And if rook b3, king a2 takes, and a7, no way to get the rook back. White gets the queen, and the game ends immediately. So Ralph plays the move e4. We get a7, we get e3 being played, and here we have the move king c2. One last little touch by Arjun to win the game. You could make the queen and win, but after you queen and black goes e2 here, after queen takes f3, queen and king c2, white still has an extra rook, but why do you want to allow it? And I also just realized while I was going through the line, I think there might also be rook f1, king c2, and e2. And I guess here rook to h5 is apparently winning, because if black queens, you have queen h8 mate, and if takes, you have queen g2 check, winning the pawn. This is pretty insane, frankly, to find. So king c2 is a nice way to avoid any of the nonsense here, because after e2 is played, king e2, rook e3, and king e1 here. If you go rook e8, I have rook to b8, pawn guards the rook, get a queen. If you go rook to a3, I have rook a5, pawn guards the rook, I get a queen, and I win the game. So a masterful game from Arjun to win this. This means he is now on 5 out of 5 on board 3 for India. India is simply on cruise control. They dominate Azerbaijan in this match. I think it's currently 2.5-1/2. There's still a game between Vida and Shakar going on, but India is firing on all cylinders right now. Arjun, with this win, is now, I think, up to about 2790. He's the clear number 4 player in the world right now, so he's having a remarkable event, and he's showing why he should be getting invitations to the absolute top level tournaments. All right. So you're probably thinking that's it. Well, we have one more game to look at, and the last game we're going to be looking at is a game played between Vasily Ivanchuk, one of the legends of the game of chess, and the heroes yesterday when he defeated Wesley So from the United States of America to lead Ukraine to a massive victory. And today he is playing against Richard Rapport, the Hungarian hometown favorite, the board one, and the top player from the country. So we got the move d4 from Ivanchuk, knight f6. Also, I do want to point out that Rapport and Ivanchuk are two of the most creative and exciting players in the game of chess. They, in many cases, will throw away objectivity in order to try and play like ours, be creative. So we are expecting big fireworks in the game. Get c4, g6, knight c3, and now Richard plays the move d5, trying to play the classic Grunfeld defense. Chuki goes knight f3, bishop g7, and here we get the move bishop f4. Now, one funny thing is that this is actually a system that I played against Chuki in the Tal Memorial in 2013, I believe it was, or maybe it was 2012, where against Chuki playing the Grunfeld with black, I also played this bishop f4 setup, and I did lose that game with the white pieces, I believe. Was it bishop f4 or bishop g5? Now I'm doubting myself. At any rate, Chuki has a lot of experience in the Grunfeld with both sides. So we get the move rook c1, now we have the move bishop g4, and here the game continues with e3. Rapport goes c5 here, we get takes, and now we have the move bishop takes knight, queen takes bishop, and this move knight e4. Now, at this point, it's a very sharp position. White is up a pawn on c5, but with a lack of development on the king side here, the idea that black can play e5 to hit the bishop, maybe queen a5 as well to hit the knight and the pawn on this diagonal. Black is going for quick counterplay in return for sacrificing material. So in this position, Ivanchuk takes with a pawn. We get bishop takes knight, takes, and now we get this move queen takes d5. White is still up a pawn on c5, but black is threatening to end the game immediately with queen to d2 checkmate. So Ivanchuk goes rook d1. We get to move queen to e6 here, and let's take some stock of the position. Now, one thing I like to say is, chess is a game of 1,000 rules. You try to learn the rules, and then you learn when you can break them. And this is a prime example from both sides. First of all, from the black standpoint, you've given up the classic fianchettoed bishop on g7, so you have dark square weaknesses here. Additionally, you're down material in the center of the board with these pawns, and so black has violated a lot of the basic principles. On the other hand, so has white on the one hand. You'll notice the white king is still stuck in the center. We're on move 14. You have weak pawns all over the board here, and so there are drawbacks for both sides. Chugi plays move rook d4, trying to attack the knight, and now we get the move knight takes pawn. Material has evened out here, and after bishop c4, you're probably thinking, wait, white has D's bishops here. It's looking very, very scary for black. Now, I will point out that white is a little bit better according to the engine, but you have to be extremely precise here from both sides. So Rapport goes queen c6. Chugi plays move bishop d5, and this is a move that I understand playing in this situation, because the match is sort of spinning wildly out of control. They're in trouble on some of the other boards, and you want to try to go for glory. And yesterday, it did work for Ivanchuk when he did not make the boring draw with the white pieces. So Rapport goes queen b5. We get the move a4 here, and this is actually the start of where we're going to be seeing quite a few computer lines. These are lines that are not human, in my opinion. Almost certainly could never happen in this game, but it shows how rich chess is as a game. So the first line we're going to look at is bishop h6, the top computer line. If black moves the rook away, you have queen f7 and queen g7 checkmate. So what black should do is play knight d3 check, and after king d2, black can now play this move queen to b2 check, sacking the horse, followed by knight d7, where the knight is jumping to either c5 or e5. Now, white is winning here, I want to be clear, according to the computer, after this very wild move, rook to b4, ignoring the fork with knight e5, because after knight e5 and king e4, the king attacks the knight, rook attacks the queen, and after queen c3, you can now go rook b3, attacking the queen. Black moves the queen away, you just take the horse, you're running up in the center of the board with the king, and apparently black is down too much material to mount serious mating threats. So this is the first thing that I want to point out. The next line that I'm going to show you guys within this whole structure is that after knight d7, rook b4, if black plays knight c5 check, you go king c4, and if black takes, you go king c5 check, king d4 here, and after queen d2, you simply go king e4, queen c3, and rook d4. Now the king is running fast to the king side here to f4, g4, and h3, and once again, with white having 2 extra bishops, white is completely winning the game. So this is very fascinating stuff to see, and it shows how rich chess is. Would this have happened in the game? I have no idea, honestly. So instead, we get a4. Rapport plays knight d3, king d2, and now we get queen b2 anyway. Takes, and here black goes for another creative idea with knight to a6 here, trying to jump with a knight to c5. Now, the reason he goes to a6 is if you go to d7, you'll notice that knight e5 is not a threat. The bishop covers the square here, and I think after rook to c4 in this position, there's a slight difference. I'm not sure what it is. But white is actually better. So Rapport plays knight a6, trying to go for knight c5. We now get to move rook c4, and here we have the move rook a d8. Now the computer prefers rook f d8, which is not very human. I'm not sure exactly why it is, because honestly, it feels like after bishop c7, you're weakening the pawn on f7 here. But after the move e6, takes, black is better. In fact, I think we're going to get this via transposition anyway. So actually, no, sorry, I'm wrong. We got bishop e5. Worth pointing out here that in this position, the computer says bishop h6 is the best move, and after e6, bishop takes f8, rook takes d5. You can sack the queen and go rook c8, followed by bishop a3 or bishop a6 to win the game. And if black plays the move king takes f8, you get e4, takes, and b5. And this is one big mess on the board. I honestly have no idea who's better and what's going on, but the computer says it's a draw. Instead, Chugi plays the move bishop e5, and now after e6, white is simply losing the game. Ivanchuk plays the move queen f6. We get rook takes bishop, and now we have king to e4. Chugi desperately trying to run to the center, use the AA battery to checkmate the black king on this diagonal. Unfortunately here, Richard finds the best move, which is to sack the rook with rook takes bishop on e5, and now white is completely lost, because in this position, if you take with the queen after queen e2 here, king is stuck in the middle of the board. If you play like rook d4, there's f5 check, king f4, and then queen g4 checkmate. And if you play a move like queen d4, another option. Now there's e5 here. If you move the queen here, you lose the rook. If you go queen d5, I believe there's just queen f2 and queen f5 or queen g2 winning. And if you go king e5 in this position, again, queen f2 is winning because of rook e8, rook d8. The king has no safety in the center of the board in this position. So instead, Ivanchuk takes with the king on e5 here. Now the king is very active, but unfortunately, even though the king can't be attacked immediately here, the king and the queen aren't really threatening any mate threat. So if black can just play a couple of calm moves here before white gets the lolly checkmate with, say, something like, I'm just going to set it up, something like this, for example, where you get the checkmate idea. As long as you avoid the lolly mate, black will be winning. So Richard goes queen e2 here, attacking the rook. We get rook to d4, and now we have the move knight to b8. A nice move, rotating the knight back towards either c6 or d7 to go for d's forks. So Ivanchuk plays rook d6 here, and now we get the move queen to c4. Another nice move here, cutting off the king. The white king desperately wants to run backwards. Actually, let me set up a better example. Say you got some position like, I guess here it doesn't quite work, so I'm just going to set up. You'd like to run the king back to f3 and g3 here, something like, you know, queen here takes, and king g3 or king g5 even. You're desperately trying to get the king out of the middle of the board, but you can't really do that in this position because here the king can't run back. King just cannot go backwards here. It's cut off, and with knight c6 and knight d7, the white king is just too far up the board. So Ivanchuk plays the move queen f4 here, and after this move, he simply resigns the game. The reason he resigned this position is here black can play the move f6, checking the king. King can't move anywhere. The only move you have is queen takes pawn. But now after I mean, literally any move, I mean, knight c6 is probably clean as what takes. Check, king f4, rook takes queen, king g3. Many ways to mate, but even just taking the rook is good enough where you're up a queen and you win the game. So Ivanchuk plays queen f4 and resigns here. At this point, the best move probably is rook h d1. But after knight c6, takes, and queen takes rook, white is actually up a pawn in this position, which is crazy to believe. But with all these weaknesses on g2, c3, and a4, g4 is the top computer move. Black can simply take, and after rook d4 here, queen c7, king e4, something simple like queen takes h2 is good enough. Black now has 2 extra pawns. The white king is still completely wide open in the middle of the board, and the position is hopeless. So Richard gets a massive win for the Hungarian team. Hungary would go on to win this match, I believe, by a score of 2.5 to 1.5. There is one game still remaining between Korobov and Berkesh, but I do believe that will be a draw. So Hungary is going to remain undefeated with 5 points out of 5. They, of course, are the home team, the favorites to try and medal. But a great win by Rapport in this game. Very exciting game, which I think was a lot of fun. You see top players sometimes violate the principles, get away with it. So I thought it was pretty fun to take a look at. So on that note, as we move forward to the next round, the only teams that I believe have perfect scores are China, India, and Hungary. There might be 1 or 2 others, but very few teams remain perfect in the Olympiad, and we're going to get more and more big matchups as the event continues. So I hope you guys have enjoyed this recap from the 5th round of the 45th Chess Olympiad in Budapest, Hungary, and I'll be back with a great recap tomorrow after round number 6. So I hope you guys enjoyed it. Have a great rest of your day, and I'll see you very soon. Keep it real. Bye.